Most people think about prepping. The first things that come to mind are usually food, water, maybe backup power, and all those are important, but one of the first things to fail in many emergencies is communications. It really doesn't take a lot for cell service and the internet to go offline, and if that happens, one of your biggest concerns will be getting in contact with your loved ones. One of the best ways to get around all this is to set up a PACE plan. PACE stands for primary, alternate, contingency, and emergency. It gives you a layered system so that if one method fails, you've got a backup and then a couple more after that. So today, we're going to walk through how to set up a PACE plan from the perspective of normal folks. So if you've used one as part of like an organization, what we talk about here may look a little different than what you're used to. First up, we have your primary communication method, and that's what you use every day. For most of us, that's going to be our cell phone, text messages, and online messaging apps. And the good news is that in many disasters, your phone may still work, especially at the beginning. Unfortunately, though, it may not be very reliable. Even if you have signal, networks can get overloaded pretty quick, especially during large-scale emergencies. Voice calls tend to get affected more since they use more resources, so if you can't make a call, try sending a text. They use a lot less bandwidth and may go through when voice calls won't. Make sure your family knows that if we can't call each other, just try texting, and teach them to keep those messages short and to the point. Things like, "I'm safe," "at home," or "battery at 50%. Then there's also messaging apps like Signal, WhatsApp, or Messenger that may still work when regular SMS messaging won't, especially if Wi-Fi is still online. Just keep in mind, though, that they do require internet access, so while they're not a guaranteed option, they might still be useful. That was the case a few years ago when the AT&T network went down. I couldn't make calls or send regular texts, but if I was somewhere that happened to have Wi-Fi, I could send messages with that. Then there's other things that you can do, like have an out-of-state contact. I talk a lot more about that side of things in my 72-hour survival plan. It goes over how to set up a family communications plan, the gear that you need, and what else that you need to do to survive the first 3 days of a crisis. You can check that out using the link in the description below. Then another thing that we should all take into account when it comes to our primary communications method is power, because your cell phone isn't going to do you a bit of good if it's dead, so be sure that you can keep it charged. Solar chargers, car adapters, and USB battery banks are all good options. We have a few Anchor battery banks that we keep around the house, and I always try to carry one of these with me if I travel away from home. Also, be sure to have the right cords and that they're in good shape. Then after that, landlines are another possible option. If you live in an area where you still have old school phone lines, a basic corded phone will usually work even when the power's out. Just be sure that you have a regular corded phone, because the ones with a portable handset will still require electricity. Next up, we have alternate communication options. These are common and easy to use, but not as effective as your primary method. And this is where we start to get more into the prepper side of things. The most basic form of alternate communications is an emergency radio. They're a good way to pick up alerts from local radio stations and NOAA, but they can only receive transmissions. You can't use them to transmit. So if you're in a situation where you need to get in contact with somebody, they're not really going to be that useful. But one thing that you may be able to use is a set of GMRS radios. They give you a way to talk that doesn't rely on outside infrastructure, but they're still fairly easy to use. And if you're looking to upgrade your prepper comms, then Outlast Supply is a great place to do that. I like working with them since they sell high quality gear from the best names out there. I've used them before. They ship my stuff out fast, and I got exactly what I ordered. I'd recommend them to anybody that I know personally. And if you want to check them out, then be sure to use the link in the description below, and they'll also give you 10% off when you use this code. GMRS stands for General Mobile Radio Service. It gives you access to higher power and better range than the basic FRS walkie-talkies that you find at big box and sporting goods stores. Unlike FRS, which is totally license-free, GMRS does require a license to use. While society is up and running, I always have to put that little nugget of joy down in there, but the license isn't that hard to get. There's no test, it only costs $35, and it covers your entire family for 10 years. The hardest part of the process is navigating the stinking FCC website, which is basically as useful as 60 grit toilet paper, but GMRS radios can put out up to 50 watts of power on certain channels, which is way more than the 0.5 to 2 watts that you get with FRS, which means that you can get much better range out of them, especially if you're using upgraded antennas, which is another thing that you cannot do with FRS. Even handheld GMRS radios can typically push out 4 to 5 watts, and that can make a big difference in real-world usage. Using the longer antenna that came with these, I was able to communicate with my wife from around a mile away in an area with uneven terrain and a lot of trees, cars, and buildings. If either one of us were at a higher elevation or not in the middle of town, the range probably would have been a lot more. The chances of a regular bubble pack radio being able to do that are pretty stinking slim. You can also extend the range of your GMRS radios using repeaters, and we'll talk more about that later in the video. Then most GMRS radios are also simple to use. There's no complex programming required, and many of them come preloaded with standard GMRS and NOAA weather channels, so you can just turn them on, set your channel, and then you're good to go. My 6-year-old loves playing with these. All I have to do is set the channel and he can talk to me without any problems. He can also switch over to the NOAA and FM radio features without any help at all. Now, not all GMRS radios have those features, especially the FM radio, but several of them do. Now, if you're trying to set up alternate comms with your family or group, the first thing you should do is choose a primary channel and have everyone program it into their radios. Make sure they also know how to enable any subtone or privacy codes if you plan to use those. Of course, that should be done ahead of time, but everyone in your family should be trained on how that works just in case something happens to your settings, and it's also a good idea to have a laminated card taped to your radio with that information as well. Also, do occasional radio checks. Have everyone turn on the radios, pick a time to call in, and make sure that they can hear each other. That way, when things go bad, they're already comfortable with using these things. It's also a good idea to set up a communication schedule. Let's say that the phones go down and you don't know where your spouse or kids are. The plan could be to turn on your GMRS radios at the top of every hour and listen for 10 minutes. That way you're not wasting a ton of battery power or missing a call if someone's trying to reach out. But where GMRS radios really shine is neighborhood preparedness. If you've got even a few people on your block who are willing to pick up a radio and learn how to use it, then you can establish a local emergency network that works even when everything else doesn't. And since they're so easy to use, pretty much anyone could figure out how to do it. If you live in a larger neighborhood or a rural area, setting up a GMRS base station at a centrally located home and adding an external antenna would give you a hub that would help everyone stay in contact. Another good thing about GMRS radios is that they can be mixed with FRS radios since they use the same frequencies. This means you can hand out cheap little walkie-talkies to neighbors who aren't licensed and keep group leaders who are on your GMRS radios. The two groups can communicate with one another on the shared channels. It's a great way to bring more people into the fold without requiring everybody to jump through all those licensing hoops right away. GMRS radios also don't cost a whole lot. I've seen pairs of decent radios sell for around half as much as an expensive set of walkie-talkies, and that's with better features and more power. They're just not as pretty sometimes. You can get basic GMRS handhelds for around $25 each, or a pretty good pair of them for around $50 or $60. The main downside to GMRS radios, though, is their range. While they're good for short-range comms, you'll probably need something a little different for longer distances. And that's where the contingency tier of your emergency communication plan comes into play. These methods may not be as accessible as the others, but they can reach a lot further. Like I mentioned earlier, one big advantage of GMRS radios is that they can use repeaters, which are basically relay stations. They take your radio signal and rebroadcast it at a higher power. If you're able to set it up somewhere elevated, like from a mountaintop or a tall hill, you could go from a 1 or 2 mile range with a handheld to 10, 20, even 50 miles or more, depending on the location and setup. Another nice thing about this is that you don't have to set up your own repeater to use necessarily. There are dozens of public GMRS repeaters all over the country, and many of them are listed on websites like mygmrs.com. You just search your zip code, find one nearby, and program it into your radio. Some repeaters are open access, and others may require permission, but if you find one in your area, it could be a big force multiplier for your comms plan. Just keep in mind, though, that if the grid goes down, public repeaters will go offline if whoever owns them doesn't have backup power, but you can always set up your own if you want to. You could do that permanently at a high elevation or mounted to a tower, or you could do a temporary setup using some sort of mobile station with an antenna mast and backup power. That way your entire group can communicate across long distances without relying on cell towers or the internet. Then you can also boost the power of your GMRS setup by using mobile or base units. Those run at higher wattages than handhelds and have a lot more options when it comes to antenna upgrades. This means that you can get better coverage over a wider area even without a repeater. Let's say your handheld gets you like half a mile of usable range in your neighborhood. That same area might open up to like 3 or 5 miles if you have a properly set up mobile unit. And if you got a base station at your house with a high gain antenna and backup power, then you've got a central hub that can talk to other homes, vehicles, or even people out in the field with handhelds. So even if everything else is offline, your group should still be able to coordinate. But if you want to get serious about radio comms, then you should definitely consider getting some ham radios. Using them is a little more involved since it requires a license and some training, but after you get all that mess out of the way, you have a reliable long-range communication method that doesn't rely on any outside infrastructure. A technician class license, which is the entry-level license, gives you access to VHF and UHF bands. That means you can hit amateur radio repeaters and participate in emergency nets. With more advanced licenses and equipment, you can go even further and talk to other states or countries since you have access to all HF frequencies. Then another contingency option is a satellite phone. While these are fairly easy to use, they're way too expensive for most folks. The phones themselves are several $100s and the plans for them cost about as much each year. They also have to be used in open areas. It's not like a cell phone where you can reliably make phone calls from your couch in the living room. Even trees can make getting a connection difficult. So while they are useful in some cases, they may be out of range for most folks. Then the last tier of a PACE plan is emergency communications, and these are what you use as a last resort. They're slower and less effective than other methods, but they're still better than nothing. One of the oldest examples of this would be a runner, someone who would take a message from you and literally run it to someone else, like Paul Revere and the British are coming. Then other things like flares, flashlight signals, and even whistles can be grouped here as well. And while those can work okay if you're part of a neighborhood watch or some other group, they may not be useful if you're just one person separated from their loved ones and trying to get in touch. That's where a little bit of planning can make a really big difference. Instead of relying on being able to make contact when everything goes downhill, everyone should know what they should do in an emergency long before one ever even happens. If you and your spouse are at work, what are you going to do? Do you both head home or go straight to your in-laws who live out of town? Also, who's going to pick up your kids, and what do you do if you can't reach your home because of a flood or something else? You can learn more about all that in my 72-hour course that I mentioned earlier. Just use the link in the description below. So at the end of the day, a good PACE plan gives you a layered, redundant communication strategy. Each layer should cover for the weaknesses of the others, greatly reducing the chances of you or a loved one being stuck with no idea what's going on. If you found this video useful, please be sure to share it because that really helps us out. And if you want to learn more about my GMRS radios and other preps that you'll actually use, then click here. Or if you want to see the items that would vanish in a crisis, then click here. Once again, I'd like to thank Outlast Supply for sponsoring us today. Thank y'all for stopping by. Y'all have a good one.